Lecture 10, Early Church and the Magisterium on Marriage. Aided by the Holy Spirit, the early church fathers further developed the understanding of Jesus as bridegroom and the church as bride in multiple ways. We will look at a few of these before moving on to magisterial teachings on marriage. Early Church on Marriage. St. Leo the Great's positive concept of our Christian identity helps to properly situate the early church's understanding of marriage. In accordance with the scripture's teaching, we are participants of the divine nature, St. Leo the Great exhorted. Christian, remember your dignity and know that you share in God's own nature. Do not return by sin to your former base condition. Bear in mind who is your head and of whose body you are a member. Do not forget that you have been rescued from the power of darkness and brought into the light of God's kingdom. St. John Chrysostom, in his commentary on Ephesians chapter 5, locates the dignity of a Christian marriage within the context of Christ's mystical body, specifically his love for his bride, the church. In commenting on verse 26, Chrysostom reminds husbands that in marrying the church, Christ loved her even though her members were deformed and dirtied by sin. Furthermore, despite faults of her members, Christ is so faithful to his bride that he even died on the cross for her. After the example of Christ, Christian husbands are to be faithful to their wives. He gave himself up for her that he might cleanse and sanctify her. So the church was not pure. She had blemishes. She was ugly and cheap. Whatever kind of wife you marry, you will never take a bride like Christ did when he married the church. You will never marry anyone estranged from you as the church was from Christ. Despite all this, he did not abhor or hate her for her extraordinary corruption. Later, in his commentary, Chrysostom encourages men not to place undue importance on outward beauty, since such beauty is often full of conceit and licentiousness. It makes men jealous and fills men with lustful thought, but does it give any pleasure? Perhaps for 1 or 2 months, or a year at most, but then no longer. The love that began on honest grounds still continues ardently, since its object is beauty of the soul and not of the body. Look for affection, gentleness, and humility in a wife. These are tokens of beauty. In teaching that marriage does not only consist of babies and bonding, but also, due to its sacramental nature, is a sanctifying reality, he writes, "Tell her that you love her more than your own life, because this present life is nothing, and that your only hope is that two of you pass through this life in such a way that in the world to come you will be united in perfect love. Say to her, our time here is brief and fleeting, but if we are pleasing to God, we can exchange this life for the kingdom to come. Then we will be perfectly one both with Christ and each other, and our pleasure will know no bounds." In the above passage, Preachy points out, Chrysostom does not teach that in heaven earthly marriages will be terminated, but rather teaches that in heaven earthly marriages will be fulfilled and heightened to their utmost potential. The reason, Petrie explains, is that in heaven spouses will be infinitely closer when the earthly sign of marriage gives way to the eternal reality of perfect union with God and one another. Along with affirming the great dignity of Christian marriage, Chrysostom, in commenting on Paul, provides practical advice for a well-ordered household. Such a household is not a relationship where there is equal authority. A household cannot be a democracy ruled by everyone, but the authority must necessarily rest in one person. Due to this natural requirement, Chrysostom writes, Paul places the head in authority and the body in obedience for the sake of peace. The ultimate reason Chrysostom provides, once again, is Christ's relationship to his church. Chrysostom explains, the same is true for the church. When men are led by the Spirit of Christ, then there is peace. Chrysostom identifies the authority, the one who represents Christ the head with the Father, and the heart of the body with the body. St. Paul would not speak so earnestly about this subject, writes Chrysostom, without serious reason. Why else would he say, "Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord"? Because when harmony prevails, the children are raised well, the household is kept in order, and neighbors, friends, and relatives praise the result. Great benefits, both for families and states, are thus produced. When it is otherwise, however, everything is thrown into confusion and turned upside down. In responding to the objection that respectful obedience to a husband is in tension with the dynamics of love, Chrysostom responds, how, one may say, is there to be love where there is respect? Love is most powerfully present when accompanied by respect, for what she loves she also reveres, and what she reveres she also loves. She reveres him as the head and loves him as a member of the whole body. God's purpose in ordering marriage is peace. One takes the husband's role, one takes the wife's role, one in guiding, one in supporting. If both has the same roles, there would be no peace. The house is not rightly governed when all have precisely the same roles. There must be a differentiation of roles under a single head. The common vicious attitude of husbands who do assume the leadership role in their families that Chrysostom calls attention to is threatening, lording it over her, or intimidating her. On the other hand, the common vicious attitude of wives to husband leaders is rejecting, hating, spurning, and nagging him. Petrie comments on this aspect of Chrysostom's writing on marriage and family in two ways. First, in relationship to a marriage between a husband and a wife, and second, in relationship to the spiritual marriage between pastors and their flock. With respect to the first, Petrie writes, because marriage is supposed to reflect Christ's love for the church, there is no excuse for male domination or intimidation. Likewise, when the Christian wife supports her husband and respects him by refusing to criticize him or tear him down, she too becomes a living icon of the church's joyful response to the sacrificial love of Jesus the bridegroom. Similarly, priests are not to be abusive and domineering towards those they lead, and those who are led, which includes priests in relationship to their bishops, are not to criticize and tear down their leaders. Along with understanding marriage from the perspective of Christ's marriage to the church, the early church also viewed baptism as a kind of marriage. For this reason, those to be baptized first disrobed, then were baptized, and finally were clothed in white garments, signifying the garments of a bride whose spouse is Christ. A function of the early women helpers, diaconisse, was to assist women who disrobe and are baptized. Magisterial teaching on marriage. Although writing over 1,500 years after Chrysostom, Pope Pius XI, in his encyclical letter on Christian marriage, Casti Connubii, similarly affirmed the husband's role as the head of the family, with the wife's role as the heart. This subjection, however, does not deny or take away the liberty, writes the Pope, which fully belongs to the woman both in view of her dignity as a human person and in view of her most noble office as wife and mother and companion. Nor does it bid her to obey her husband's every request, even if not in harmony with right reason or with the dignity due to a wife. Nor, in fine, does it imply that the wife should be put on a level with those persons who in law are called minors, to whom it is not customary to allow free exercise of their rights on account of their lack of mature judgment, or of their ignorance of human affairs. But it forbids that exaggerated liberty which cares not for the good of the family. It forbids that in this body which is the family, the heart be separated from the head to the great detriment of the whole body, and the proximate danger of ruin. For if the man is the head, the woman is the heart, and as he occupies the chief place in ruling, so she may and ought to claim for herself the chief place in love. Another example of similarities of thought between an early church father and a modern pope is between St. Augustine's bride and bridegroom analogies and John Paul II's. Both developed Revelation's marital imagery. Two examples from Augustine are as follows. In those two original humans, the marriage of Christ and the church was prefigured. As Adam was a type of Christ, so too was the creation of Eve from the sleeping Adam, a prefiguration of the creation of the church from the side of the Lord as he slept. For as he suffered and died on the cross and was struck by a lance, The sacraments which form the church flowed forth from him. By Christ's sleeping we are also to understand his passion. As Eve came from the side of the sleeping Adam, so the church was born from the side of the suffering Christ. Like a bridegroom, Christ went forth from his nuptial chamber. He came even to the marriage bed of the cross, and there, ascending it, he consummated a marriage. And when he sensed the creature sighing in her breath, he surrendered her himself to torment for his bride in a communication of love. A particular notable example of John Paul II's development of Revelation's marital imagery is from his apostolic letter on women, Mulieris Dignitatem. Here we read, in the letter to the Ephesians we encounter a second dimension of the analogy which, taken as a whole, serves to reveal the great mystery. This is a symbolic dimension. If God's love for the human person, for the chosen people of Israel, is presented by the prophets as the love of the bridegroom for the bride, such an analogy expresses the spousal quality and the divine and non-human character of God's love. For your Maker is your husband, the God of the whole earth he is called. The same can also be said of the spousal love of Christ the Redeemer. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. It is a matter, therefore, of God's love expressed by means of the redemption accomplished by Christ. According to St. Paul's letter, this love is like the spousal love of human spouses, but naturally is not the same. For the analogy implies a likeness, while at the same time leaving ample room for non-likeness. This is easily seen in regard to the person of the bride. According to the letter to the Ephesians, the bride is the church, just as for the prophets the bride was Israel. She is therefore a collective subject and not an individual subject, person. This collective subject is the people of God, a community made up of many persons, both men and women. Christ has loved the church precisely as a community, as the people of God. At the same time, in this church, which in the same passage is also called his body, he has loved every individual person. For Christ has redeemed all without exception, every man and woman. It is precisely this love of God which is expressed in the redemption. The spousal character of this love reaches completion in the history of humanity and of the world. Christ has entered this history and remains in it as the bridegroom who has given himself. To give means to become a sincere gift in the most complete and radical way. Greater love has no man than this. According to this conception, all human beings, both men and women, are called through the church to be bride of Christ, the Redeemer of the world. In this way, being the bride, and thus the feminine element, becomes a symbol of all that is human. According to the words of St. Paul, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. From a linguistic viewpoint, we can say that the analogy of spousal love found in the letter to the Ephesians links what is masculine to what is feminine, since as members of the church, men too are included in the concept of bride. This should not surprise us, for St. Paul, in order to express his mission in Christ and in the church, speaks of the little children with whom he is again in travail. In the sphere of what is human, of what is humanly personal, masculinity and femininity are distinct, yet at the same time they complete and explain each other. This is also present in the great analogy of the bride in the letter to the Ephesians. In the church, every human being, male and female, is the bride, in that he or she accepts the gifts of the love of Christ the Redeemer, and seeks to respond to it with the gift of his or her own person. Christ is the bridegroom. This expresses the truth about the love of God, who first loved us, and who, with the gift generated by the spousal love for man, has exceeded all human expectations. He loved them to the end. The bridegroom, the Son consubstantial with the Father as God, became the Son of Mary. He became the Son of Man, true man, a male. The symbol of the bridegroom is masculine. This masculine symbol represents a human aspect of the divine love which God has for Israel, for the church, and for all people. Meditating on what the Gospels say about Christ's attitude towards women, we can conclude that as a man, a son of Israel, he revealed the dignity of the daughters of Abraham, the dignity belonging to women from the very beginning on an equal footing with men. At the same time, Christ emphasized the originality which distinguishes women from men, all the richness lavished upon women in the mystery of creation. Christ's attitude towards women serves as a model of what the letter to the Ephesians expresses with the concept of bridegroom. Precisely because Christ's divine love is the love of a bridegroom, it is the model and pattern of all human love, men's love in particular. Benedict XVI further developed John Paul II theology of marriage by writing specifically on love, especially in eros, that is desirous, wanting to receive love, and agape, giving love. In doing so, he interrelates them and argues that in Christianity, both types of love are important. The receptive love of eros is proper to creatures, since only God is the ultimate giver by being the creator. Nonetheless, human eros needs to be transformed by agape love, since we are called to participate in God's nature as giver. He writes, "The more the two, in their different aspects, find a proper unity in the one reality of love, the more the true nature of love in general is realized. Even if eros is at first mainly covetous and ascending, a fascination for the great promise of happiness in drawing near to the other, it is less and less concerned with itself, increasingly seeking the happiness of the other, is concerned more and more with the beloved, bestows itself and wants to be there for the other. The element of agape thus enters into this love, for otherwise eros is impoverished and even loses its own nature. On the other hand, man cannot live by ablative descending love alone. He cannot always give, he must also receive. Anyone who wishes to give love must also receive love as a gift. Certainly, as the Lord tells us, one can become a source from which rivers of living water flow. Yet to become such a source, one must constantly drink anew from the original source, which is Jesus Christ, from whose pierced heart flows the love of God. In the account of Jacob's ladder, the fathers of the church saw this inseparable connection between ascending and descending love, between eros which seeks God and agape which passes on the gift received, symbolized in various ways. In that biblical passage we read how the patriarch Jacob saw in a dream, above the stone which was his pillow, a ladder reaching up to heaven, on which the angels of God were ascending and descending. A particular striking interpretation of this vision is presented by Pope Gregory the Great in his pastoral rule. He tells us that the good pastor must be rooted in contemplation. Only in this way will he be able to take upon himself the needs of others and make them his own. St. Gregory speaks in this context of St. Paul, who was borne aloft to the most exalted mysteries of God, and hence, having descended once more, he was able to become all things to all men. He also points out to the example of Moses, who entered the tabernacle time and again, remaining in dialogue with God, so that when he emerged he would be at the service of his people. Within the tent he is borne aloft through contemplation, while without it he is completely engaged in helping those who suffer. We now turn our attention to spiritual marriage, in which eros is called to be transformed in particularly intensive manner by agape love. This spiritual marriage is expressed by two groups of people, virgins and celibates. While the married state was viewed in the early church as a highly dignified state, because of its relationship to Christ's love for the church, virginity and celibacy were not seen as a lesser good, but rather as an even greater good. This belief is contained in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where he writes, "If anyone thinks he's not behaving properly towards his fiancée, if his passions are strong, and so it has to be, let him marry as he wishes. It is no sin. Let them marry. But if someone stands firm in his resolve, being under no necessity but having his own desire under control, and has determined in his own mind to keep her as his fiancée, he will do well. So then, he who marries his fiancée does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do better." Due to a loss of appreciation for the vocation to virginity and celibacy, the Council of Trent decreed, if anyone says that the marriage state is to be placed above the state of virginity or of celibacy, and that it is not better or more blessed to remain in virginity or in celibacy than to be united in matrimony, let him be anathema. as Revelation teaches and repeated by Trent, the choice between marriage, the virginity, or celibacy is a choice between two goods, with virginity and celibacy being the better good for those who are called. While virginity and celibacy both shine forth Christ's perfect universal love and his marriage to his heavenly bride, the earthly marriages only foreshadow. The two do so in different and complementary manners. Virgins represent the church as the bride of Christ, and celibates represent Christ as bridegroom. Petrie directs our attention to the church's liturgy, where this is made explicit. For example, in its teaching on the Liturgy of the Hours, the Catechism of the Catholic Church states, "The Liturgy of the Hours is truly the voice of the bride herself addressed to her bridegroom. It is the very prayer which Christ himself, together with his body, addresses to the Father." In a similar vein of thought, the rite of consecration to a life of virginity reads, "The Church is the bride of Christ. This title of the Church was given by the fathers and doctors of the Church to those like you who speak to us of the world to come, where there is no marrying or giving in marriage. You are a sign of the great mystery of salvation, proclaimed at the beginning of human history and fulfilled in the marriage covenant between Christ and his Church." In the next lecture, we will focus our attention on priests and bridegrooms. God bless.